Okay, let's talk about labor unions. So first we need to begin with the conditions that led to unionization. There were very long hours. In 1860, the majority of people were working 60-hour work weeks, whereas today we're used to a 40-hour work week. So that was an issue. Dangerous working conditions. These were things that owners were not willing to fix, and it was a difficulty for many of the workers. Low wages. People weren't paid what they felt that they were worth. And this, again, is at the same time that the wealthy are getting wealthier as the poor are remaining very, very poor, and there's a huge gap between the rich and poor. We also have children working. As you can see in the picture here, this is a very famous photograph, and it shows children working on machinery. That child that you see is barefoot, and little fingers and little toes were valuable to employers because they could get into small spaces, but they could also get chopped off or caught and mangled very easily. And then again, we have that gap between the rich and the poor that is such an important part of the Gilded Age. And all of this is going to lead to increased tensions between workers and employers. It's not a mystery to employers that the owners of the factories that they work in or the railroads where they work are very, very, very wealthy while they are just struggling to get by. Okay, before we continue talking more about the different unions and strikes that were taking place, I just want to go over socialism very briefly. You should recall socialism from Global II. When you learned about the Industrial Revolution, you learned about this particular belief and philosophy. And it is a belief that workers should control the means of production, and that can be factories, that can be railroads, that can be mines where you get the raw materials. But this is a belief that the workers who create the wealth should be the ones controlling the wealth, and that the nation's wealth should be distributed equally amongst the people. It was more popular in Europe than in America. There are a lot of different reasons why. A lot has to do with our political structure in America as opposed to Europe. But we're not going to get into that. Just understand that it definitely took root more firmly in Europe than America, although there were certainly people in America that found it appealing, particularly workers who felt helpless and hopeless in their situation, that whatever they did, their lives were not going to be improving and their wages were not going to be improving. But the majority of Americans saw it as a dangerous philosophy, and it was undermining that free enterprise system and that capitalism that America was so strongly founded on, where we have people owning the means of production, private individuals and private ownership. And so the majority of Americans believe that socialism was a very, very bad and dangerous idea. The first really successful labor union was known as the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869. And this labor union was more successful than previous efforts because it was open to all workers. Men, women, skilled, unskilled, even blacks were allowed to join the union as well. The only ones they really excluded were people involved in gambling or the liquor industry, or lawyers or bankers or doctors, people who were, fairly well-to-do. The main leader in the 1880s who increased the membership to 700,000 by the late 1880s was Terence Powderly, so that's a name you should be familiar with. Their goals were equal pay for equal work, an 8-hour workday, no child labor. Those are the main goals that you should understand. And again, they were inclusive, so they included many different groups of people, and not all of the unions did that. So that's an important thing to remember about the Knights of Labor. And here you see pictured 2 of the early members of the Knights of Labor. The next union you should be familiar with is the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers, who you see pictured here. This union was specifically geared towards skilled workers. It was an exclusive union because it excluded women, immigrants, African Americans, any unskilled workers basically, so it was different in that respect from the Knights of Labor. Their main goal was what's called bread and butter unionism. That's improving wages and work hours, but not seeking any kind of radical demands from employers. They just wanted what you see in this quote here: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. And what this means is they want to have an 8-hour workday, and they want to be able to have 8 hours for rest. 8 hours is the normal amount an adult is supposed to sleep, basically, and 8 hours for what we will. And what we will means what we want to do. This is our leisure time. We will spend it how we want. But people shouldn't be working 10, 12, 14, even longer days without having some sort of leisure time to enjoy their lives, basically. The bread and butter unionism aspect just refers to the fact that these people wanted to have bread and butter on their tables. They wanted to be able to feed their families. They weren't asking for any kind of socialist type requests like a redistribution of wealth or anything like that. They just wanted some basic demands met. The Industrial Workers of the World was founded in 1905. They're also known as the Wobblies, that's their nickname, or the IWW, of course, is the initials of the organization. This is mostly unskilled workers. It did include men, women, and African Americans, and it had the support of socialists in the United States. So this one tended to be a more socialist-leaning union than the other ones that we've been talking about, and certainly advocated kind of a worldwide brotherhood of workers. And you can see the picture here. Join the one big union. This one big union that is on a worldwide scale, basically. Okay, the next union is the American Railway Union, founded in 1893. Eugene V. Debs was one of the founders of this union, and he's a name to remember because he was a socialist, and he ran as a socialist candidate for president in several elections. This union was for railroad workers, unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled workers, anybody who worked on the railroads would be part of this union. Another union is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. We can tell from the name this was geared towards women. Sweatshop workers, women who were working in mostly the garment industry. They were working at sewing machines for long hours of the day. It merged with the AFL, that American Federation of Labor that we talked about in 1910, and it gained a lot of momentum and support after the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire that we'll be talking about later. The first strike you need to be familiar with is the Great Railway Strike of 1877. And keep in mind, this year should sound familiar to you because it's the same year that Reconstruction ended. And Rutherford B. Hayes was president this year. Railroad workers went on strike due to a wage cut. Railroad work was also very dangerous, so that was always something that the railroad workers were concerned about. But the wage cut was definitely what precipitated this particular strike. And it started in West Virginia, but it spread to other major railroad lines and cities as well. And so at its peak, 100,000 railroad workers were on strike. You can see in the picture there was a great deal of chaos here, and you can see on the left-hand side, you see troops firing at the crowds of strikers that you see on the right-hand side, and you do see people injured or dead in this picture. There were about 100 deaths throughout the country in different locations because of the conflict with the strike. President Hayes ended up having to order troops to break up the strike, and soldiers fired on rioters, and that was what precipitated some of the deaths in the strike. But this is the first major strike in American history where workers walk off the job because they are fed up and they're demanding some sort of change. In this case, they want that wage cut turned around. They want that wage cut overturned so that they get the wages they were paid back. Imagine making a certain amount of money and then being told that you're not going to make that amount any longer, and that was very frustrating to them. The Haymarket Riot in 1886 took place in Chicago, and this began as a strike of workers in Chicago. Police killed a striker during a fight between the strikers and scabs. Now, scabs is a term you should be familiar with. Scabs are people that employers bring in to work when their normal employees go out on strike. And so there can be a great deal of animosity between strikers and scabs because the strikers are angry at the scabs for going in and taking their jobs, basically. you know, it's seen as a great betrayal, basically. Someone tossed a bomb into the police lines during this strike, and the police ended up firing back their weapons at them. In the whole conflict, 8 police were killed, 4 strikers were killed, 8 anarchists were charged with causing this riot, basically. 4 of them were executed by hanging. 1 committed suicide in prison. And anarchy is something, again, you'll remember from Global 2. You learned about it at the same time you would have learned about socialism, and this is that philosophy of basically getting rid of government. That government is kind of an evil force and needs to be gotten rid of. This was a very, very ugly scene, and the public began to turn against the labor movement. They felt that they were not just radical, but violent and dangerous too. Our next strike is the Homestead Strike in 1892. This took place at the Homestead Steel Works, which was a steel plant owned by Andrew Carnegie, who we've talked about before, one of these captains of industry or robber barons, depending on how you see it. But we know that he was a great philanthropist. Remember, he gave a lot of his money away. However, at the same time, he cut wages. A wage cut was announced by the manager of this factory, a man named Frick, and the people working there were furious. This was a 20% wage cut. This is a big cut in wages and a big hit to these people. Frick hired Pinkerton detectives, security guards, basically, 300 of them to protect the plant and the scabs that were working there. Remember, the scabs are those substitute workers, basically, that have been hired to fill in for the strikers. The workers actually were able to take control of the plant, however, despite those 300 Pinkerton guards, and eventually the Pennsylvania militia was sent in, and that's what you see in that photograph there. They're marching in to regain control and reopen the plant. This definitely created difficulty for the steel industry, for the workers in it, to create unions. And so you will really see no successful unionization in the steel industry until the 1930s after this point. The next strike is the Pullman strike in 1894. The Pullman Company was a railroad car making company, and they actually operated a town for its workers. So that whole town was dedicated to Pullman. The people lived in the town and the people worked in the town. Now what happened is that they cut wages. You know, that's a familiar theme that we're seeing here. But what they also did is keep rent the same. So the people living in these towns, the workers, had to pay rent to the Pullman Company. And while their wages are being cut, the rent is not being decreased. So that's going to cause them a lot of anger. These strikes spread to other railroads as well. And President Cleveland, our own Grover Cleveland from Buffalo, at the time, sent in troops because the mail was not able to be delivered. This was interfering with the U.S. Postal Service. So he used that as the justification for sending troops in. He also used the Sherman Antitrust Act to argue that the Union was an illegal trust interfering with free trade. So this is an interesting way to look at the Sherman Antitrust Act, because that was really designed as something to interfere with these illegal combinations of businesses, such as monopolies. But what it's being used for here is something against labor, and that is something that you're going to see a pattern of at this time. The U.S. government really seems to care more for businesses than the workers, and that's a pattern that we see here. Eugene V. Debs, who we know was the head of the American Railway Union, he was sent to jail for organizing this strike. One of the most tragic incidents involving labor in the United States was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This took place in New York City, and it was several women about your age, basically. Many of them were immigrants. They worked all day long at sewing machines, and what they were sewing is what you can see on the right there. Those are ladies' shirtwaists. Shirtwaists are a blouse, basically. You wear it with the skirt, and you can see several of the styles there. I believe they mostly made a white variety of this shirt, but that was the popular fashion at the day. That's what most women wore. When the fire began, women tried to flee, but doors were locked. Emergency exits were blocked. There really were no emergency exits back then. They were basically locked into the building, and later it was found out that was to keep them from leaving early. The fire escapes that there were on the building were inadequate for the amount of people who were trying to get out, so they were collapsing as women tried to get out of them. 145 workers died. The vast majority were young immigrant women, and like I said, they were about your age for the most part. And the only silver lining in this horrible tragedy is that people saw the need for improving working conditions and creating laws to protect workers and their safety. And New York State, because of this tragedy, will be one of the first states in the country to really advocate for these laws. And that's the one good thing that comes out of this terrible tragedy. This would be the worst workplace disaster or accident in New York City history until the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. Now, hopefully you've seen how very violent and tumultuous the labor movement was in this period of time. And it really, because of all of the violence, it really lost a lot of support of the American people. And it really declined, and we won't see a strong labor movement until really the Great Depression and the New Deal. So why did it decline? First was opposition from business owners. Obviously, the business owners don't like people advocating for higher wages and better conditions. And some ways that they fought against the unions included yellow dog contracts. This meant that workers were forced to sign these contracts stating that they would not join a union. So if in order to get the job, you had to sign this contract. The other thing was blacklists. And these were names of workers who had joined unions, and these would be circulated amongst business owners. So if you had joined a union previously, your name would be on this list, and that meant that it would be very difficult for you to get a job, particularly in certain industries. And the owners just wouldn't negotiate with unions. They didn't feel they needed to negotiate with unions, and they felt there was enough workers out there that would fill the void if those other workers quit. The courts in this country also turned that Sherman Antitrust Act against labor. Again, that was an act that was designed against monopolies and trusts, and what it actually was being used for was against the labor unions. And the other thing is the violence of the strikes. It really led to a loss of public support. A lot of people thought the strikers and the unions were very, very violent and too militant and too radical, and so many people lost the support of the unions. So we won't see a strong labor movement for several decades after this period.